Kick off, though, with what's becoming the really burning issue about COVID and
it really is in terms of people's inability to pay levies, bodies corporates' decisions to defer costs. I've had one client who's already, I've seen, just sent an email to everyone in a very large building basically say, okay, no one has to pay their levies for the next month. And it doesn't quite work that way. And I think that's going to be the issue that we're all faced with going forward in terms of what happens when people can't pay. From both body corporate on the 10th of February. And I think the one golden rule for bodies corporates is you cannot have hard and fast rules that apply to all. Every single situation needs to be looked at on its merits. So in that sense, I don't think it's appropriate for a body corporate, for want of a better phrase, to have a scorched earth policy in terms of levies. Everyone must pay, that's it. Everyone's circumstances are going to be different. And the other thing, I suppose, is that everyone's under a significant degree of pressure, rain, hail or shine. Like it even, we're no different to everyone else. We're working from home, issues in terms of what's going on with our business, leaving aside the pressure. We've got clients hitting us with a bunch of stuff that isn't precedent driven, isn't process driven, and we've really got to think on our feet and digest whatever the latest issue might be from a government announcement, which again, Chris and I were talking about before, which will come up again today. So I think, that payment issue and not having one size fits all is really, really important. Everyone's got to look at it.
That's right, Frank. So the legislative position in Queensland, and I guess it's the same in other states to some extent, there will be some variances, is that the body corporate has expenses. It has outgoings that it needs to pay, and it pays those by way of contributions from owners, and there are proportionate contributions from each owner. Those contributions stem from the budget, which is set every year at the general meeting. So the process is general meeting has a budget, it gets passed. From that, the contributions are set, and then you go ahead and pay them if you're the owner, and they're usually sent out quarterly. There's no provision to have zero levies. The only way, I think Frank and I were talking about this, the only way that can really happen is if the body corporate had zero expenses to pay. Had zero expenses to pay now and zero expenses anticipated in the future. Given that that's an impossibility, the body corporate will always have an expense, therefore there will always be a contribution that owners have to pay. Bear in mind also that if you're an owner and you are behind on contributions, then that impacts on your ability to vote at a general meeting. And so you really have to, I think that's a really important point. It's all well and good to say, I don't want to pay my levies, or I can't afford to pay my levies, or the levies are too much. If you don't pay the levies, you lose the right to vote. And that's a pretty significant issue depending upon what it is that you vote about. In Queensland, there is the ability for a committee to waive penalties, interest and other charges. So there is that ability. And they must do it under what are called, I think, Frank, special reasons.
For special reasons. Yep.
And one of those special reasons may well be that you've lost your job, that you actually, one of the reasons you weren't able to pay on time was that you lost your job, or that you were in hospital, or you were caring for a sick family member. There's a real onus, this is what Frank was saying just before, there's a real onus, isn't there, Frank, for bodies corporate to not just apply a blanket policy, but to act reasonably and treat each situation on its merit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think probably one of the other things seen a little bit of, and this is also the Chris coming out of me, is the humanity of this. I mean, and that's the reality. It does, for me, remind me a lot of the GFC in certain circumstances. The difference was the GFC, I think, probably took 18 months for 2 years for everyone to realise the world had changed. This has taken about 3 weeks. It's just extraordinary the speed with which this economic tsunami arrived. So I think more than anything else, it's not just a matter of belting people for the sake of belting people. And we've already seen some behaviour in a body corporate context on behalf of a range of participants, which in the cold light of day in 6 months' time won't look particularly good. And I think it's probably, again, one of the lessons, or one of the things we certainly give to all of the lawyers that start with us, is every single thing you write or say, you've got to look at it in the context of what would that look like if put in front of a judge in 12 months' time? How would you explain that? And I think probably some of the things that are flying around, and absolutely you see that with people under pressure and the immediacy of response and the ability to bang out an email at, whatever time of night it might be when you're feeling anger, distress or otherwise, and particularly from a committee perspective, just calming down and slowing down for a second, I think, is really what needs to happen in a lot of these things. Because, yes, there might be a group of owners that can't pay their levies, but we don't need to make a decision on that right now, this very minute, within 5 minutes of their request.
That's right.
It's just... Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right, Frank. You've got to remember the humanity of the situation. So the process, as I would see it, is if there's a budget being passed and the levies have been set, an extraordinary general meeting can be called at which the voters can vote upon an amended budget. That's the opportunity for the body corporate to look at changing the levies payable. And it makes sense. If the financial circumstances have changed, maybe look at calling an extraordinary general meeting to get that budget adjusted. I think that answers a question from Elspeth, who asked a question along those lines.
And there's a bunch of other questions lurking in here, mate. You see, look at transfers from admin and sinking funds. So I suppose body corporate fundamentals, admin fund is real expenditure you're going to spend through the course of the year. Body corporate has a bunch of I suppose you'd call it contracted requirements, statutory requirements, be that insurance, be that a strata management contract, be that caretaking salary, etc., etc. In theory, every year it should raise 200 grand, it should spend 200 grand. I mean, it doesn't look like that on an annual basis because the money's coming in and out at different times. We think if there is going to be some flexibility, it's probably going to relate to sinking funds, where bodies corporates may be able to defer certain expenditure based on what the needs of the scheme might or might not be. And again, this is not hard and fast rules. This is something you would need to go and actually have a look at your own particular circumstances on. But for example, maybe the body corporate is budgeting towards painting the building in 3 years' time, when the reality is it could wait for 5. So you might be able to spread that expenditure or defer that expenditure in the sinking fund over a period of time. But as a rule, there's no ability to transfer monies between sinking and admin funds. So if you've got an admin fund with X, you've got a sinking fund with a healthy balance, chuck a figure at it, chuck $1 million, you can't transfer 200 of that across to the admin fund. That has been raised for a specific reason and must stay in that fund. Now, you might not, if you can come up with the appropriate budget, the appropriate sinking fund forecast, need to raise the 300 grand next year that you thought you were going to raise. Maybe you trim that back because you change what the expenditure is that you're forecasting, but that $1 million base is still there. It might only increase by 200 grand instead of the 400 grand you had budgeted.
Yep.
So I think that's a really important thing. And Queensland, it's very specific that the Act actually says you cannot transfer.
Next question. Strata fees have gone up nearly 300% over 8 months ago. Have a payment due. What can I do? It goes back towards what Frank and I were saying before. If the levies are becoming a problem for the body corporate, and presumably the person who asked this question wouldn't be alone in this situation, it's important. You will need to go back to a general meeting or an extraordinary general meeting and seek to have the budget amended. If you've got a levy notice due, the problem with not paying it is that you place yourself, first of all, in the position where you can't vote. But second of all, in Queensland anyway, the body corporate is obliged to pursue that debt at some point from you, 2 years, 2 months to be precise. So you need to start the dialogue with the body corporate about a possible payment plan. You need to show some commitment towards paying it. And I've had initial discussions with body corporate managers who've asked me, what information can we ask for? Body corporate committees need to have enough information to make a reasonable decision. So they need to ask themselves, how much do we need to know in order to be assured that we can make a decision about a payment plan? And this is where my point about, and Frank's point about empathy and humanity really kicks in. You don't want to be in a situation necessarily where you're asking a lot of very intrusive questions of someone who's already under an enormous amount of health stress, emotional stress and financial stress. So it's about reasonable requests in order to make a reasonable decision. A couple of quick questions that we got beforehand from somebody saying that's been proposed that the next quarter's strata levies reduced by 50% due to COVID. Do we see any merit in that? Well, the biggest merit is that you're paying less. probably the less facetious answer I would have is that the body corporate needs to make sure it's got money sufficient to pay its bills. So you need to have the committee needs to very, very carefully go over the cash flow, the incomings, the outgoings, and make some very sound decisions, I would argue, in consultation with their body corporate manager, financial advisor or accountant. But as to whether that works for you in your particular circumstances, that's what you will be asked to vote upon, presumably if it goes to the general meeting. You need to make that call based upon the information that you have. If you need to see financials, ask for copies of financials to make that decision for yourself. A couple of questions then got asked about, well, if those facilities such as pools and gyms are closing, do we get a reduction in our levies? My response to that is, well, yes, it's true that common property you can't use for a period of time, but on the flip side of that, it's more than likely the committee and the body corporate manager and indeed the caretaker have seen their level of inquiries, their level of work skyrocket as a result of this situation with people calling them and asking them questions. So whatever quote-unquote reduction that some people might see in one area will no doubt be absorbed in other areas. And even if you could argue that you deserved a reduction in levies, how are you going to measure that? If the pool is closed to you for the next 6 months, for argument's sake, how are you going to put a price on 6 months non-use of the swimming pool in relation to your levies? I'm not sure how you make that kind of calculation, frankly.
And the other problem would be that it actually requires the same maintenance. The costs of running the pool haven't changed.
Yep.
Maybe the chlorine drops by a little bit. I don't know. But it's still got the same electricity, the same filter, it requires the same cleaning, all that sort of stuff. So the costs of the body corporate have not changed. Your right to use the common property facilities probably has, but that's not necessarily a monetary thing as much as it is this is really annoying thing. Yep. I'm paying for this thing which I can't use, but that cost is still there.
Yep. And somebody's just commented along those lines in the live chat.
Yes.
Bearing in mind, this is quite separate from rent reductions. So I'm only talking now about an owner's responsibility towards levies. There is a very separate question about tenants and their reductions in rents. That's being covered quite separately. I can't comment upon that in this discussion. On a related topic, is there any talk of placing body corporate contributions on hold during this crisis? There's been nothing mentioned by government. We've already talked about the need for bodies corporate to collect levies to pay bills. Next part of that question, is it reasonable to ask the caretaker to take a cut in the salary they receive? Well, presumably they're still doing the same work and they're probably doing more into the bargain. The same goes for the body corporate manager, I would have thought. Yes, it's true that most people are taking reductions in pay and reductions in conditions, but you've got to base that upon actuals. And I don't know what you think, Frank, but if there's no change in the duties of the caretaker, it's hard to argue that they need a cut in their pay, I would thought.
And agree, mate. And look, it's obviously we act for strata managers, we act for caretakers, we act for bodies corporates, but so I'll throw that sort of non-independent hat into the ring. But my experience with people that are in management rights and strata managers is that their stress levels have gone through the roof in the same way that I suppose in a sense our has. And I mean, and for me, it's just the intensity of everything at the moment is right up there with anything I've seen from a GFC perspective. It's just, people's are under enormous financial pressure. There's a whole lot of unknowns, and that just creates tension. So I know all of the strata managers I talk to are getting bombarded with, if you're a strata manager running, you'd say a herd of 80 buildings that might have 800, 1,000 owners, a lot of those people, independent of the committees, are contacting the strata managers with what's going on. And that level of inquiry on top of the day-to-day stuff, which you then add levies and all the rest of it, is a pretty intense working environment. So at the moment, and mate, I think we're the same in that sense in terms of working. There's nothing easy about any of this. So it's all a very intense environment. So, and I know it's easy to say that we should be cutting. And maybe, and I'll say probably a discretionary spend is lawyers. Maybe if you've got 20 grand in your admin fund budget for lawyers for the next 12 months, you carve that back to 10 or 5. and then perhaps you try to solve things via perhaps the mediation service that we put Chris Hynes on to do, rather than engaging in a big extended legal bun fight. That might be a better use of your money. Perhaps there's repair and maintenance that you might have a line item of 20 where you decide not to spend all of that along the way. So there's a degree of discretionary spending in body corporates, but not much. And it'll be more along the lines of the sinking fund in terms of deferring some items that might be able to be deferred or extended or whatever it might be.
That information